Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Chaucer's Books virtual author discussion with Victoria Shorr. My name is Michael Takeuchi, and I'm the events coordinator at Chaucer's Bookstore, going on 47-year-old independent bookstore based in Santa Barbara, California. To purchase tonight's book, The Plum Trees, to purchase other books, or check out our upcoming events, please go to our website at chaucersbooks.com. Our unofficial local authors events week concludes on Tuesday when Jeff Arch, the Oscar-nominated screenwriter for the movie Sleepless in Seattle, will talk about his first novel, Attachments, with #1 New York Times bestseller, Christina Baker Klein. 1 week from tonight, we welcome Sarah Dykman, who wrote Bicycling with Butterflies, a thousands of miles journey by bicycle to track the migration of the monarch butterfly. While our guests and myself are the only ones seen and heard on this webinar, there's the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen. So please feel free to utilize this, and time permitting, we hope to get to these questions. Tonight's event is being recorded for our YouTube channel and simulcast. And if you're watching from YouTube, please email your questions to events@chaucersbooks.com. The video will be recorded or available shortly after program's completion. So here we go. Tonight, we welcome home Victoria Shorr. The Plum Trees is a wonderful novel that I finally got my hands on because we kept selling out of. When I started, I wanted to call in sick to work. It is that riveting from start to finish. On June 6th, Victoria's book will be reviewed in the New York Times Book Review section. But Victoria's she's done many things, and she's also author of 2 other novels, Midnight and Backlands. She co-founded the Archer School for Girls in Los Angeles and the Pine Ridge Girls School in South Dakota, the first independently culturally based college prep schools for girls on a native reservation in America. Wow. Please welcome from New York, New York, Victoria Shorr. Hello, Vicki.
So happy to be here.
And joining Vicki is Professor Benjamin Jerry Cohen, a specialist in international economy, who joined the UCSB department in 1991 before previously teaching at Princeton University and the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. He's the author of 16 books, including his newest book, Currency, Space, Statecraft, Monetary Rivalry and Geopolitical Ambition, which published by University of Chicago Press in 2019. In addition, Jerry is married to one of my favorite authors I've ever worked with, Jane DeHart, who wrote Ruth Gator Ginsburg, A Life. Please welcome our moderator, Jerry Cohen.
Good evening. So, Vicki, we've agreed that we'll chat for about a half hour or so, and then we'll open it up to questions from what I'm sure is a very large audience out there. This is a wonderful book, as Michael says. It is difficult to stop once one starts reading. It's gripping, at times painful, and certainly rewarding. An obvious first question to ask you is simply, why did you decide to write a book like this? What was your purpose? What motivated you?
Well, it was really almost like a stealth attack for me. I was at the funeral of a very beloved uncle in Cleveland, Ohio, and I was shown a letter that I had somehow never seen, that he had written from Germany in 1945, where he was a soldier fighting for the American Army right after the war. In this letter, which was to my grandfather, to his father, he was explaining that he had met two cousins, two of my grandfather's nieces who had survived the death camps, which in itself was so interesting, a story that I'd never heard. But then he mentions in the letter that they told him that that their uncle, my grandfather's brother, Herman, had escaped from Auschwitz. In the letter, they said they knew that he had escaped from Auschwitz, that as he was there with them and he was strong and healthy, they had hopes that he, of the whole family, might still be alive. I read this, I was astounded. No one had ever mentioned this. And in my own small reading really about the subject, I'd never heard about any escapes from Auschwitz. So I was interested. There was no one really to ask. It was so ironic. My uncle had just died. Of course, I could have asked him about this question. Herman had never come back after the war, so it was assumed that he hadn't survived. So the question really was, what was the story here? I made some just really kind of desultory investigations, couldn't find anyone still alive who could tell me anything. So I thought I'd go over to the Museum of Tolerance in Los Angeles and just see if they had any books on the subject and then go home. I was working on my book Backlands about Brazil, and I had a trip to Brazil scheduled, etc. That day, however, the library at the Museum of Tolerance was not fully open that day, but there was a little placard saying that there was a speaker across the street in the museum who had survived Auschwitz. And I thought, well, I'll go listen to her and then drive home. Fine. So what luck that there was a speaker that day. So I went over, I listened to her speak. She was very heartfelt. It was hard to understand her entirely. It was mostly school children and me. But afterwards, when I went up, she invited the kids up to look at her arm, at the numbers on her arm, which they all crowded around to do. As I went up to sort of thank her, I found myself just kind of speechless and in tears. And I realized how moved I was. There was something way beyond anything I expected. I also learned that they were having speakers, this was 10 years ago, every day at the museum. And I started going. And I realized that I was privy to witnesses of what it would almost be like hearing Odysseus or Cassandra, Clytemnestra herself, telling about, a very intense, multi-layered, tragic story. So my motivation then really was to listen. It was also, what I was learning was very different from just the general run-of-the-mill knowledge we have of the story. And soon I found myself motivated to keep going, and even though this wasn't the initial idea.
You said this incident was 10 years ago. Did you work for 10 years on this book, or did you set it aside from time to time? How did you,
I wrote the first version of it about 10 years ago. And I felt that it was, it was very much what I wanted to say, but I was having trouble getting it published. And then 2 years ago, I sat down and realized I'd left out some very important connective tissues. So I rewrote it in a summer. I didn't rewrite most of it. I just rewrote the end part of part one and then connected it to part two.
now, once you got your revised version, your revised manuscript complete, and you were ready to send it to a publisher, how different was it, if at all, from what you had in mind when you started? Did it evolve over time?
Well, I had started, really, my plan was to write about the Herman's supposed escape. But as I was started listening to these witnesses, I realized that the story I wanted to tell was from the beginning to the end. this was different from what I'd originally planned because it also took the book into fiction. There's nothing fictional in the book, in that there's nothing that isn't true in the book. There are no details that aren't based on someone's firsthand account. But no one, I did learn that no one tells a complete story. If you want to tell the story from people living in a nice house in their nice town with among friends and other townspeople, a nice citizen paying their taxes, living their lives, to getting them onto a train to Auschwitz, you have to listen to a lot of different people because no one tells it from beginning to end. But I wanted to tell it from beginning to end because I wanted to get rid of this idea that people didn't resist, that people were sheep to slaughter. That is an absolute false construct. And I thought the best way to deal with that was to really tell a story in a way that people could understand how it could have and would have happened to them.
It had to be difficult for you to write in such detail about experiences in Auschwitz. How did you steel yourself to deal with that kind of material?
Well, one has to. I remember hearing a man speak who had the worst job really since the history of the world, which he had to take the bodies out of the gas chamber and put them into the ovens to burn them up. And he said that the way he survived was by distancing himself. He was supposed to stand by the door of the gas chamber, and when it went silent, then open the door. But he couldn't do that. It just was driving him mad to hear people screaming and praying and all that. So he would take care of himself by going away, and he knew how long he had essentially, and then getting back. I had, of course, nothing like this kind of problem, but I would come home at night and just not want to have dinner. My family, if somebody said, I'm hungry, I would say, well, not like Auschwitz, where I was, I had books that I would turn over so I didn't have the covers to look at. I just would try to go out and look at the moon, look at the stars, just try to leave it behind. But it's hard to leave behind, and you almost don't want to leave it behind because it's, these people went through it, and they deserve to be thought about and honored and remembered.
Did it give you nightmares?
It did, and they mostly, stopped. I don't dream about it the way I was for a while, but it's funny, just having grown up, hearing a little bit about this, one was subject to nightmares, more, throughout one's life, where does one hide, who could be coming into the house to get you, that sort of thing.
You said that there's nothing in the book that was not true, that was not reported to you in one way or another. Did you do a lot of interviewing?
Well, I didn't do a lot of interviewing. I did a lot of listening. I really didn't interview anyone. I listened to these witnesses talk, first at the Museum of Tolerance, until I'd pretty much heard all of them over maybe half a year. And then I went down to the Shoah Foundation, which is at USC. And they have, Steven Spielberg had funded a project to interview people who had survived the death camps. And so I listened to a lot of witnesses on tape there. And that was amazing too.
I suspect it was. I think maybe I'd like to shift a little to talk about the book itself rather than the experience of the writing. And I'd like to start with what I think is a fairly obvious question, and that is, what are we to make of the title, The Plum Trees? What is the significance of the plum trees in your mind?
Well, to me, the plum trees are the is a direct opposite of Nazism. The plum trees are cultivation, their beauty, their life, their civilization. So there's that aspect to them. They were a direct answer to the march of death that was Nazism. Main legacy.
As I read the book, I was puzzling over what significance we should attach to the metaphor of the plum trees. And it seems to me that there were 2 or 3 different possibilities in your text. I'm going to be a real academic here, and I'm going to say on page 78, because I took notes, on page 78, you actually refer to the plum trees as God's domain. That these were the plum trees were the domain of God. What did you mean by that?
I mean, that's where sort of beauty and truth lie. You know, Herman could go out and look at those and take and believe, I mean, alas, that there was goodness in on earth, you know?
At some other points in the text, it seems that you were equating the plum trees with the old days, the former order, the life that they lived before the Nazis.
Right, the age of enlightenment at some point, I think I refer to Herman.
I think you actually referred to the plum trees at one time as simply the before.
Yeah, and you know, it was his rootedness. You know, the plum trees signified his connection to a land that he thought was his, that he was trying to make his. He was trying to belong there. He was trying to be a Czech. It's this ancient dream that we all have of belonging, of a nation, of being part of something, you know, and the plum trees for him was that. And you know, so it just
Hermann is an interesting character, and it's hard to know whether to respect him or to think that he was terribly wrong. You write a number of times that he never broke the law, and you can either see that as somebody who's really very respectable, or somebody who's naive. How would you interpret his determination to respect the law?
I think that was very much his sense of himself as a Czech citizen, as someone who was part of a new democracy, trying to build a new world. A dream so many of us know from our history books here in 1776. I mean, not, you know, just that sort of belief and excitement about being part of something new that would be really worth it, really wonderful. He was also, you know, as a well-off member of the community, it was easy for him to stay within the law up until then. You know, then suddenly he found himself with a terrible conundrum, because he was no longer considered a citizen by his government, by his state. So if you're no longer a citizen, and if the laws no longer are respecting you, then do you have to follow the laws? He had to go outside the law, when all of a sudden the law would have meant marching his daughters down to the train station to be deported. Then the law was no longer seemed to be applicable to him anymore. It no longer even seemed to be the law. And that's it's a very tricky question, because, you know, there are probably people who went marching into the Capitol on, you know, recently here, who probably thought that they were doing the right thing, that they were taking the law into their own hands, because so that's where that kind of thinking can lead. In this case, it led to Herman at least buying some time for his daughters. But you're right in saying, do we respect him or do we not? I of course love and respect him, but we all, you know, it's easy to keep hoping and to keep being optimistic, and to, you know, the question would be now, sitting in your house right now, and someone comes and tells you, you have to flee now to China. You know, you don't speak the language, you can't take anything with you. You're going to be poor. You're going to start on the bottom. You may not even survive, but even if you do, maybe you can be the washwoman, but maybe you can't. Maybe someone else is already there. And you've got to go now. Would you do it? Or would you say, no, no, things are going to be better. This is just a temporary problem. That's how we mostly work. You know? So it's, I think it's understandable.
You know, you're absolutely right that the decision to leave had to be an extremely difficult one. The question is the hero the person who stays behind, or is the hero the person who flees?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I always thought he was heroic for staying, although of course he did die. You know, we know this. We don't know how he died, but we do know that he never came back. And so did most everyone else in the family. So, but, you know, I always thought the letter that when my grandfather got him an affidavit to come to America, it was called an affidavit. We would call it a visa or something, I think now. And he wrote back and said, you know, Czechoslovakia is a democracy like America. This is our country and we love it. And I've always admired that letter, which I heard about. I haven't seen that letter, but I always admired that impulse. Of course, a lot of the people who left were people in Germany. Very few of the people killed in the concentration camps actually were Germans, because they saw Kristallnacht showed them, which was a huge uprising in 1938, gave them they could see that things weren't going to get better, that things were bad, that everyone was out in the streets, not just a few bad actors. So they left. Some people, a good number of people in Austria were also beaten, etc., early on, and realized that they didn't have to take their money. If they got out with their lives, that would be okay. But other people didn't know what was going on.
It was interesting earlier, a few minutes ago, you said it had to be a shock to suddenly find yourself deprived of your citizenship. But the reality, as you described so well in the book, was a reality of small incremental steps. It wasn't that from one day to the next, they went from full citizenship to full deprivation of citizenship. You accurately described the incremental nature of the deprivation, little by little. And that certainly made the decision to leave more difficult, because it was always possible that to think, well, this is the last increment. This is the last.
Right, exactly. Okay, we can do without this or do without that.
But I think that you really described very well the very incremental process by which all of this took place. A couple of more questions, and then we can turn it to the audience. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
I'm just going to say that was very important to me, because I didn't want people to be able to say, well, I would have left, or why didn't they leave, or why didn't they resist, or why didn't, you know, the questions that come up. I wanted people to understand what it would have been like for them too, not just.
But just a couple more questions, and then we'll give the audience an opportunity. First question of the last two. What does your book have to say for the world today? In other words, some people might pick it up and say, well, this is an interesting history, but it has nothing to say to me about today's world. Do you feel that you have a message in this book for the contemporary period?
Yeah, I do. I think that I think one of the messages was really brought in on January 6th. There it was, right in front of our eyes, where what happens when you don't stand against this kind of rioting, this kind of hatred, this kind of unlawful uprising that was tolerated in the early days by nice Germans when it was Hitler, you know, before he really had consolidated his power. people just let those things slide. You know, it's very, very important to stand. And I think this book has that lesson really, you know, you can draw that lesson quite clearly. I also think it's always good to revisit a tragic situation so that to make sure that you feel it, you know, as a tragedy and would never inflict it on someone else in a different guise, you know, that you wouldn't be one of the people joining in racial hatred against any group when you see it depicted this way.
Okay. I agree with you completely. As a reader of your book, that it has great relevance for the contemporary era, but I thought the audience would hear it, would like to hear it from you. Last question before we go to the audience. Completely separate from the plum trees, what are you going to give us next? What do we have to look forward to?
Well, I have a book that I think will come out in about a year about two very different American families that is quite different from this. This book was different from my other work as well, usual work, but I hope it's equally interesting. And then I have been involved in founding two very different girls' schools, one in Los Angeles and one in a very different community on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota. And I've been trying to organize in my mind a way to tell, really to just talk about that, the logistics of all that, and even how to found a girls' school.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, that's great. So we know what we can look
Yeah.
forward to. Let me just see if we have some. I see no open questions. Maybe I'm doing this wrong. If Michael is listening still, Michael, have you got any?
Not yet, so I invite our audience, please, to ask Victoria questions.
I don't see any here.
In the meantime, Jerry, if you had another point to make or another question, we can go to that and then refer to audience. Oh, here's one right now. Okay, from Howard. Victoria, was it difficult to find a publisher? And can you describe that process?
Well, for my first book, it was extremely difficult to find a publisher because, I mean, I didn't publish my first book until I was in my mid-60s, but I'd been writing since I was, you know, writing things that could actually even were published, you know, for years since I was in my 30s. So yes,
I mean, just yesterday.
yeah, just yesterday. So it really was difficult. But I was sort of, it's interesting because I was looking at smaller publishers and this publisher and that publisher. And one publisher had even accepted a book of mine that was actually a very short book that was actually published as part of Midnight eventually. And then they reneged it. I mean, it was just, you know, it was just kind of a nightmare. And what kept me going was that I really believed in my work. I just couldn't understand why no one would say yes to it. And then finally it got to Norton and they said yes, which was sort of amazing when all these little like 25-year-olds were rejecting everything, you know. But you know, I always had friends who were reading my manuscripts and encouraging me and keeping me going. And my family who had read this book 10 years ago when I wrote it, my cousins and my parents and my brothers, and they loved it. So I was encouraged to, but yeah, I mean, you just keep going. And then eventually, you know, hopefully you find someone who will believe in you.
We have some more questions now, and one comes from somebody who may be a relative, Bill Eichner.
Right.
What did Hermann's Canadian relatives think of the book?
Well, I just sent it to them because his grandson lives in New York. He only has one descendant, a grandson. Well, now he has a lot of great granddaughters, but I'm hoping that he will like the book. I'm not sure that they will, because their mother, his mother Magda, is the main character in the book. But a lot of the things, as I say, this is what takes the book into fiction. A lot of the things that she talks about were really taken from other witnesses. I'm hoping that he will like it, but I haven't heard yet.
We have another attendee who prefers to remain anonymous. There's a very brief question. Do you believe Hermann escaped? Do you personally believe he did?
I mean, I'm not going to answer that question now, just because I would have to do a spoiler alert.
Nah.
Okay.
You know what, though, I think is interesting about that, it ended up not mattering to me. Because what mattered to me, I was looking for a hero when I started, but I found kind of 6 million of them. And so that's, that's kind of where that landed.
Mm.
We have a question from Florence Fellman. How old were you when you first heard about your grandfather's family? And what was your mental process getting to the point of wanting to write about it?
Mm.
Well, I can't say, I never remember first hearing, because what happened was my grandparents lived with us. And so the remaining survivors of his family who lived in Canada would come and visit us every year. So I grew up knowing them, and they had numbers on their arms. And so we were told the story, in some version. The version that I was told is very different from the truth. I was told that they survived Auschwitz because they were so well educated and they knew so many languages, which indeed they did, and they were beautifully educated, but that isn't why they survived Auschwitz. So that part in the book is directly from Magda's story. And but so I always knew it. But what triggered my wanting to write about it was reading this letter at my uncle's funeral and thinking, why, this was like, all of a sudden I got very excited, because to me, it had all been just ashes and death and nothing inspiring or good, just a world of sadness. But suddenly Herman had escaped. It was like a flash of red over the whole thing, a beautiful pathway out of the despair. And that's what drew me to write about, not to commit, because it happened almost, as I say, by stealth. Like all of a sudden I found myself writing about it, but that's what drew me to trying to investigate it.
Mm.
There's a further comment from Florence Fellman. She writes an added comment. There were many escapes from Auschwitz, and also Polish underground sent people in and out of the camp, notably a Lieutenant Piasecki. But the point here, of course, is that no one wanted to believe what the escapees reported.
Mm-hmm.
And that was, to me, the most astounding thing I learned, really, because I do detail in the book an escape with the help of the Polish underground. Now, this was at the very end of things. This is when you could already hear you knew the war was, the Russians were coming. Everybody knew Berlin was being bombed. Allied planes were flying over. Things were going badly for the Nazis, and the undergrounds had gotten themselves together to the point that they organized an escape that was then, this is a part of the end of the book. It was really one of the most important escapes. But again, nobody believed it. It was actually sabotaged. There were about 600 people did escape from Auschwitz, but almost about 400 of them were recaptured horribly and tortured to death.
Mm.
One more question. The question here is, I look forward to reading your book, but I'm always struck by the grace of Holocaust survivors. Do you have any thought on the source of their strength and resilience after such suffering?
You know, I talk about that in my acknowledgments at the end of the book. It's interesting because when these people start talking about their experience, they go into another sphere. They're not whoever they are, whatever their name is. They're not just that person. They reconnect with something much bigger than them. They reconnect with history and the grace that allowed them to survive, the luck, which is, huge part of it. Because as one French woman who survived said, I I survived, but my sister was better at everything and she didn't survive. I mean, it just was, um, and when they start talking, it's like they're brushed with the wings of the angel, as they say, from the root of the word enthusiasm. And are very, they're very worth talking to, they're just listening to, rather. They summon everything and they stand there. The most of the talks that I went to in person were filled with rooms of school children from LA, most of whom had absolutely no clue when they went in about this story. And they were captivated by these people. These people have, realized that they had these kids, they had a chance, and they went beyond themselves and reached out to tell them what it was like. It was really, really fun to listen to them. There was a Greek, there was a Greek man who had been a boxer. He had been 15 when he was taken. These kids were 15-year-olds. They were high school kids listening. He told them about his sister. These kids had sisters. The girls all started to cry when he was talking about this. The boys were just awestricken. He talked about surviving and finding, he was chasing down in Berlin after the war, an SS man that he recognized from the camps who had killed his cousin. And the teacher came and said, sorry, the bus is waiting, time to go home, school's out. The kids would not leave. They wanted to hear this story. They wanted to listen to this man tell it. And afterwards, it was amazing because he told the story he told was devastating. It was horrifying. But afterwards, he was there with a smile. He showed the boys some of his boxing moves. He showed them his tattoos. That he looked at their tattoos. He showed the numbers on his arms. He looked at theirs. He showed them the medals that he'd taken from the SS guy. This was the kind of thing these people did. They'd been through that, but they had the grace to know that they were part of history, and they had a responsibility to history and to the future to stand up and tell these stories.
Since there are no more questions, I'm going to pose a question, another question. As you well know, there have been a lot of films made about the Holocaust, not the least of which was the Shoah, Spielberg's movie. The list is very long. Was there anything in any of those movies that influenced the way you wrote this book?
Well, the movie Shoah, which is, I don't remember how many sessions,
It's about 8 hours long.
8 hours long, which I think I watched a couple times just straight through because I found it that fascinating, was extremely helpful. Because before that, I sort of felt like, oh, do I have to go over to Poland, to Auschwitz to be able to write this? That movie takes you there. And it also is incredibly, it's extremely intelligent. And it interviews Raoul Hilberg, who did a lot of work on the logistics of the working of the death camps. And that was a really, really important piece of it. The way the you and me's of the world, who, I'm the train scheduler, you're the person who's making the rope from human hair, you're the person who's the foreman, or you're the president of Volkswagen, who is contracting for slave labor, or you're the head of Bayer, who is sending the poison tablets. all these little pieces that make the death camps work. You know, I really got from that film as well as much else. But
Mm.
that was one that really that I spent time on. I hadn't really seen a lot of the other films because this kind of wasn't my subject. I was very involved in Brazilian uh, stories and other historical women. So, but that film, I highly recommend. I think it's a it's
Did you
very.
actually visit Auschwitz?
No, I've never been over there. I don't know if I'm ever going to go, actually.
I have been there. I, well, we all know how moving the experience can be. Um, I'd like to come back to your other books and taking your oeuvre, your corpus of books that you've written. Uh, are there any themes that you find yourself returning to repeatedly, or is each book unique in its own set of issues?
Well, I was thinking about that myself recently, and I think one of the things I really care about passionately is social justice. I also care about seeing things. I tend to see things differently, having lived a different kind of life from most people. I haven't had a regular job in my life. I've always gone out on my own since I was quite young. So I maybe bring a different perspective. When I was studying Joan of Arc, for example, I realized that no one had. I read the testimony. Luckily I could speak French and I had studied Latin, so I could read the original documents, and I realized that a big piece of her story just hadn't been told, the last week of her life, which to me was the most interesting part. When I wanted to write about Mary Shelley, I started from a wonderful book about Shelley by an English academic, Richard Holmes, whom I love, but he didn't like Mary Shelley, and I felt that was unfair, and I wanted to get to her. The Brazilian bandits book, I was totally intrigued by these people. They were a mixed race group of men and women bandits who hadn't been really taken seriously by the Brazilian intelligentsia just because of that. But I had come to them through their poetry, and I realized how brilliant the leader was, even though he wasn't classically educated. And as I say, they were mixed race, etc. Um, and they lived in the poorest part of the country. But I fell in love with the country and in love with their culture. So I saw them differently than the way that they'd been seen. They were almost considered cartoons by the general populace. And I also, their quest was a quest for social justice too.
Mm.
So, yeah.
What exactly do you have in mind when you say social justice?
I just like things to be fair. I just like
Mm.
things to be fair. I grew up in a town that was pretty egalitarian. A steel worker, it was a steel working town. A steel worker in those days could support a family. We all went to school together. There weren't private schools. I just want people to have that kind of chance. I had an amazing education. That's what I think equipped me to do what I wanted to do. And I want other people to have that education too. I mean, is that asking too much? I just don't understand why every American doesn't feel that way, since so many of us have had that. The people who've been cut out of that in America have to get that. It just makes everyone's life better. There's no reason in this country that everyone shouldn't get it. So I try to write about that. And then I try to, with the school, the reason that I was moved to co-found the girls' school in South Dakota on the Indian reservation, this is the poorest place in America. And I was reading about, I read in the New York Times that 1 in 4 babies there was being born to teen mothers with fetal alcohol syndrome. And I thought, this is not fair. Girls who go to girls' schools aren't having babies with fetal alcohol syndrome. They're on their way to college. Why aren't these girls getting that education? Why? So, you know, uh, That's what I mean really by social justice, just a fair chance. I hate being judged. I hate people judging other people without really giving them a listen or a look or a chance, you know.
Do you intend to go on writing for the rest of your life?
I guess it's, you know, I haven't the first part of COVID, I really did write what's going to be my next published book, tentatively called Midair. But since then, I haven't been writing, and I realize I get it just is so much better when I'm doing a project, you know. I miss it. I miss the engagement, I guess is really the word.
Personally, I relate to that.
Yeah, I'll bet.
I I think we're moving toward the end of the hour. Looking at the Q&A, there's only one additional entry from an anonymous attendee who says, quote, "Love the book!" Exclamation point.
Oh,
Vicky was great tonight! Exclamation point. Thanks!
Yay.
Exclamation point. I think that's a good note.
I think that was my mother.
I think that's a good note on which to bring our proceeding to the close. We all love the book. You were great tonight, and we thank you for giving us the opportunity to read what you have to say.
Thank you. And thank you, Jerry, so much. And Michael, thank you for having us. What a wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Please remember to buy the Plum Trees. It's a wonderful book.
Thank you so much.
And Jerry, and especially Victoria, thank you. It was such a very wonderful evening. Thank you. And I wish you all the best of health. And everyone, thank you for joining us. Have a nice evening.
You too.
Good night,
Bye.
all.
Bye, everyone. Good night. Thanks.